thought it'd be valuable if we sat down and talked about 2022 as a whole as the end of the year approaches. We have a lot of things that we would want from the state legislature going into the next session, which happens in a couple of weeks. 2022 in review ended kind of with a big disappointment in that the legislature came back to give themselves raises, something that even working under the assumption that they deserved the raises, a more immediate need would have been addressing violent crime in the inner city. We called for it several times. It did not happen. How did you feel when you realized $32,000 more a year would be paid to each legislator when, in our opinion, there has been legislative malpractice?
We've been screaming from the mountaintop here in Albany, because the Capitol is several blocks away, calling for our leaders to come back and to make the corrections that are necessary for our community here in Albany. And to hear them coming back and to hear them and to experience them basically working on one issue and nothing else is an incredible disappointment. I'm not here to debate the merits of anyone getting raises. That's not for me to decide. What I can say and what I will always be critical of is the fact that black and brown communities are now being used as petri dishes for public safety. And so that's my frustration. That's what I'm going to continue to talk about.
The thing here is making the assumption that raises were deserved, and most members of the legislature have acknowledged that crime is a problem. If crime is the problem that you say it is as a legislature, and you are already in Albany for unrelated business, doesn't matter what the business was, raises or something else, why not address the issue that you claim is a top priority while you're in Albany already? And there's a dynamic in Albany where you can hold certain policy items over people's head as a part of budget negotiations. Very similar dynamic here where there's a deadline and there was a point of leverage, and that point was not leveraged, which makes one question what the motivation or lack of motivation, how you explain that when it comes to addressing crime. But that being said, they're going to be back in a couple of weeks. So we have raised the age, we have bail reform, we have discovery reform. We have a lot of things that we are asking for consideration. What are the top priorities?
The top priorities right now are the top priorities of people who are living in the vulnerable communities that we are responsible for caring for. That's the top. The top priority right now is gun violence. The top priority right now is how 15 and 16 and 17-year-old kids have access to more weapons than they've ever had before. The top priority is having laws that allow for people in law enforcement and prosecutors to hold people accountable. We are in a space right now, and this is what's so frustrating for me. We're in a space right now where the options is that we tend to overcompensate when we're holding people accountable, and therefore we throw everyone in jail, or we live in the climate we're living right now, where there is no accountability whatsoever, and young people are being arrested 2, 3, 4 times in a calendar year for possessing loaded firearms. What are we saying? What are we saying right now in the state of New York? We have bold proclamations that we're doing our best to combat gun violence. We're touting all of that we've done, resources that we've put in to combating the illegal guns that are out in community. And yet, what are we seeing on the streets? We're seeing over 200 confirmed shots fired. Not on every street, mind you, because you're not going to have this kind of activity happening in the suburbs, in the hill towns. We don't have this kind of behavior occurring in certain pockets of our city communities. It's always the black and brown community, right? And it's ironic how you'll have leaders that talk about all of these bold public safety initiatives were designed to benefit black and brown communities, and yet it's the very black and brown community that is burying their children at a much more, at a higher rate, walking into emergency rooms and trauma centers in our community at a much higher rate, And my question is to the leadership of this state is, why don't we put down our political talking points? Why don't we close the door, at least for a moment, on our political strategists and just walk out onto the streets? Talk to the people who are living in these communities whose children don't go outside after 6 p.m. for fear of them being hurt and harmed. Why aren't we talking to members who are living in the communities, your constituents, and asking them about their experiences, as opposed to doubling down on the absurdity of the statistics that I've heard, uttered as political talking points, comparing crime rates to the 90s. Well, this is not as bad as it was, in the 90s. We're comparing crime rates to the 90s? We have more bloodshed now in 22, bloodshed in 21, bloodshed in 20. These 3 years, we've normalized the escalated violence of these last 3 years by making these comparisons, as opposed to what were we doing in 16? What were we doing in 15? What were we doing in the early 2000s that achieved the goals of public safety, improvements in public safety, shuttering prisons, getting people more access to health and diversion? What were we doing that delivered those results, and why aren't we doing them anymore?
It's also valuable to point out that they actually had 2 special sessions this year, and one of them, the first one, they would probably argue that they did something to address gun violence. However, the gun violence that they were responding to was not the status quo for the inner city. It was an outrageous hate crime. However, we're not having outrageous hate crimes day to day in the city of Albany. The dynamic is completely different and has been conflated, and it's worth mentioning that we differentiate these 2 things so we don't have we don't know what the origin point of violence is when January comes around. That being said, the other thing that should be considered is the outreach to the community. We say it over and over again. Building strong children better than repairing broken men. It's something that people have gotten away from because people tend to externalize their problems when they're allowed to do so, and we've allowed that to happen. So what do we want to see as far as whether it be investment monetarily or culturally from our leaders in government when it comes to investing in strong children?
We often talk about changing the culture in vulnerable communities, and it's a culture that definitely needs to be changed. We have young people that have no idea how to engage in conflict resolution. What they do is they look for the most lethal of weapons to address issues and disagreements that they may have with others. Boy, we need to change that culture. But the other culture that needs to be changed is the culture of the state capitol. I understand investments in after-school programs. They're not very sexy. It's not the kind of thing that you can put on a palm card and expect applause. You get more applause and probably more contributions from the celebrity political types when you're talking about major criminal justice reform. The reality is that Black and brown communities are very complex. And the idea that we can begin to change Black and brown communities and the outcomes that Black and brown young people experience by starting at the end of the road, which is usually the criminal justice system, is just so absurd. But I get, as a politician, I get why coming to the Capitol and making these changes and putting them on your palm card and running again to seek re-election. I understand why that works. But it's not working in the communities that you claim to serve. When you talk about disproportionate numbers of people in the criminal justice system from Black and brown communities, ask yourself, well, what's contributing to that, right? It's not as if police departments, people wake up every day and go up to work and decide, you know what, this is the neighborhood I'm going to patrol. Police are summoned to community. Why? Because this is where we have the vast majority of violent acts that are occurring, right? calls for service, thousands of calls for service, week to week, specifically in the very communities that we have the highest rates of shootings, the highest rates of violence. What that tells us is that these are also the communities that are the most desperate for other interventions as well. Our legislators, I agree with them when they say, hey, we just can't have cops and prosecutors addressing issues in community. That's not how we achieve our overall goals. And I would agree with that. On the tail end of a police prosecutorial interdiction should always be dollars associated with prevention. If you want to know what your community is going to look like in 5 years in terms of safety, how much money are we investing in a 10-year-old today? That's the metric. That's the metric we should always be using.
Well, in that sense, it seems like there is a misunderstanding of statements made that are critical of reforms and legislation. The origin point of violence and violent crime, and crime generally, is not the state legislature. They only control the conditions under which it can thrive or be minimized. However, obviously crime predates any of the reforms that we've been talking about over the past 7 or 8 months. However, the fact that the crime predates their reforms doesn't mean that they are in no way responsible for even the crimes that predate their reforms, because we can optimize conditions to minimize that crime, which is, frankly, just changing culture, which sometimes politicians have a great amount of influence over as public figures and pseudo-celebrities in some way. That being said, are you feeling optimistic, pessimistic, you vaguely hopeful? Am I going to have to talk you into being hopeful over the next couple of weeks and months?
What I'm optimistic about is this. I've worked in this community now for over 20 years. I've seen this community rise up. I've seen this community also at its lowest. What I'm always certain of is that if we provide the means for this community to triumph, they will. It will. But if what we do is continue to ignore the issues and we continue to starve it of its resources, which more often than not, those resources come in the form of human capital, then there's no reason to be hopeful. What I'm extremely disappointed about is the normalization of violence. We've reached the 200 mark of confirmed shots fired in a very small pocket of our community. 200. And that's become normalized because we hit 200 last year and the year before that. We can never normalize that kind of violence. A lot of what needs to be, the community needs to know, we keep from them intentionally. Half of our violence that occurs with the population of 16 and 17-year-olds, people don't even know about. They don't hear about it because the reporters are precluded from the courtroom. And so there's an entire, there's an entire series of events that are happening in our community that we are prohibited from discussing. Of the violent crimes that are committed by 16 and 17-year-olds, half of those crimes are committed with a firearm. Of the half that's committed with firearms, another third of that is a firearm that's been discharged, right? And yet, the law as it stands right now prohibits prosecutors and law enforcement from holding those young individuals accountable. Their cases are addressed in family court, and these individuals are back out on the street only to create and cause more harm that we then eventually stop them from doing. So, listen, I have reason to be hopeful. If the legislature is listening to anything that we're saying to them about public safety, and if they heed our warnings, I have reason to be optimistic. If they don't, and they continue to take this almost truther-like approach to public safety, then we will have we'll be here next year, same time, talking about 200 plus more confirmed shots fired in very small pockets of our community.